The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. So get ready to talk, email, and post a message to us. We are looking forward to speaking with you and responding to your questions. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi everyone, I'm so glad to be here again with you today. I will speak with you about a topic that I think is really fabulous, and that is self-compassion. We have a guest today, somebody I've done a couple of YouTube videos with, Frank Pasquill, and we are actually quite lucky to have him. He's just back in town, and Frank actually does some very interesting work with emotional tuning. You can actually visit his website, emotionaltuning.com, and download some of his videos and watch some of his material that really is about kind of focusing on the impact of trauma, and he does that with a lot of gentle work. One of our most popular videos is a video that I did with Frank, and it is really about shaking until you relax your body. And it really is all about how the body responds in a stressed state, and how when we shake, it's a natural response to dealing with stress. And that's actually a video very worth watching. Not only is it helpful, a lot of people give us great feedback on it, but it is also funny because Frank is a very amusing guy on the video. So thank you for joining us, Frank. Frank is a yoga instructor, a psychotherapist, and has deep training in working with a lot of different relaxation techniques. So really glad to have you here and here to talk about self-compassion.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that we can just start with a kind of a bit of an understanding of what self-compassion is. And what I want to start with is just the reality that compassion itself, just the word compassion means to suffer with. So whether we are expressing compassion to ourselves, to another person, what we're saying truly is that we are showing up in the most significant way when kindness is needed. And that is often something that gets overlooked. There are many people who've shared with me that in the times that they have needed people the most, they have found that many people seem to disappear, and one of the things that really concerns me is that we live in a world where the notion of being happy is so overarching in the notion of an acceptable emotion that showing up in difficult times and times when things are not going well, can be really, a time when people experience great loneliness, making it even more difficult to face the struggles of of normal life. And there simply isn't anybody who doesn't deal with stressors and struggles. I mean, it's just part of our reality. And, you know, this idea of self-compassion, a term that was coined by Dr. Christine Neff, who's also a psychologist and has done work in this area for many years. You know, she was really the first to bring this particular language to it, although it has its roots in Buddhist philosophy and practices, in the Karuna practices. And, you know, we'll cover a lot of ground, but Frank, I know that you have some thoughts about self-compassion yourself, and you know what I'm really wondering about, and this is going to relate to an email that just came in, and I'm going to make a reference to the person who sent it, which is Alan. So thank you so much, Alan, for sending this in. You've obviously done a lot of thinking about self-compassion and the impact, and Alan references an article that looks very closely at self-compassion and trauma by Jackson Herman Garbutt in 2015, and their research looks at how trauma can have a really powerful negative impact on emotional regulation and self-perception. And Alan was hoping that we might spend a little bit of time talking about this idea of kind of how shame bears an impact on victims of trauma, and he references self-compassion as a self-reflective process entailing self-kindness, like, you know, when you actually turn that sense of compassion towards yourself and extend warmth and understanding toward your own pain and suffering, as opposed to just being harshly critical or judgmental toward yourself. The next one is common humanity, where it's like, you know what, we all experience these things. We all face, you know, very tragic life events, you know, whether it's the illness or death of a loved one, or just some, you know, something that isn't such a big deal, but, you know, can get us pretty riled up. Like I was telling you, Frank, the other day that I had two water pipes that were damaged, and so we have water situation going on, and, you know, I can get very dramatic about these things, or I can choose to be really understanding that, yeah, it's normal to be stressed about having to rush and make sure that there's not a bigger crisis as a result of something non-life-threatening. And then there's mindfulness, and that's like really leaving space for or leaning towards pain, not kind of simply just numbing out or, kind of withdrawing from ourselves, but being aware in a kind of a fully embodied way of the impact of what we are facing in the moment. And, you know, I think these things, you know, really that are based on Dr. Kristen Neff's work, you know, are very important in terms of self-compassion and trauma. I just wonder what your thoughts are, Frank.
Yeah, well, in terms of what you've been mentioning, one of the things that is peculiar about trauma is that the body or the mind can't really distinguish between a real event that's happening in this moment and an event that happened in the past that you're remembering, or an event that you're thinking about in the future. And if that event has got to do with some sort of threatening situation, whether it was an actual threat of death or hurt, or whether it's just but if it's a memory, it gets lodged in kind of a remote part of the brain that is highly protective. And the response of that part of the brain, the amygdala, is usually to flood the body with adrenaline and to follow a fight or flight or freeze response. And because the body cannot, or the mind cannot distinguish between a real and an imagined event, that if people are imagining or remembering an event or considering something happening in the future, then all of those immediate responses will be felt in the body. And this is a rather unsettling thing because it doesn't seem like it does not logical. But the brain, the primitive brain that's protecting a person in traumatic situations, cannot distinguish that. So you can feel anxiety all the time and not even be aware of why you're feeling it. And it's probably because you're thinking about something that in the past that was fearful or something in the future. So people begin to feel very much ashamed of having such thoughts or having such feelings when they seem to be irrational. And quite frankly, they are irrational because it's an emotional response the body takes to protect itself. So trauma has got a natural response, and as you mentioned earlier, part of it is the natural response is to shake and to shake out that adrenaline that's pouring through your body. And sometimes when that doesn't happen or is not given the chance to happen because people either take drugs or alcohol or take a tranquilizer, that tension gets locked in the musculature, and it just is a very, very uncomfortable thing to live with. And hence the reason why a lot of people who have suffered trauma will start turning to alcohol or drugs to soothe themselves. And compassion for yourself is a way for you to soothe your own body so that you don't have to rely on other things like other things to soothe you or other people. You could be self-soothing.
Yeah, a lot of the approaches that are recommended through Dr. Christine Neff's work and many others actually who talk about self-compassion focus a lot on inner self-talk and self-inquiry and meditation approaches. And I think those are wonderful approaches. They really are lovely. We have a couple on our website, on our YouTube channel, one called Self-Compassion for Trauma Recovery, which is on the YouTube channel, What is PTSD? You can just type it in, Self-Compassion for Trauma Recovery, and I do an interview with a young man who talks about the old Pali concept of karuna, which is in the Buddhist lineage. Avi Kramer, who's the teacher who's talking with me, offers a 5-minute self-compassion meditation, and also, just the idea of a soft landing place for the suffering that we can experience in life. And, practicing these things can be very important. Now, I'm really big into practice because all of the things that you just said, they really are true. And the only real way to get access to the nervous system is in real time, to either evoke the feelings of distress that are reminders, triggers of trauma from the past, and then apply some kind of self-soothing, self-compassion approach, because these two things create reciprocal inhibition. You're retraining your body to be with the content, the trigger, the trauma, the reminder, in a softer way within inside of yourself. So because exposure, as you relate it to disturbances, actually tends to extinguish the old pathways. But, even more so, things are laid down in pretty, significant ways within inside of our being, our what I would call our infrastructure. So we have these layers of infrastructure that tell us how to react in our lives so that we can be safe, and they instruct us. It could be things that we learned before we were even 10 years old, and we're still using those old mechanisms to keep us safe today. And it can create pretty rapid response that doesn't really fit this moment. So sometimes we have to actually do more than just meditate and more than just apply self-compassion, strategies of meditation and self-talk, because we need to actually go much deeper to get access to this deeply embedded belief system and infrastructure that could even be symbolic. So, how do you get at symbolic stuff? You have to really go very, very deep, and it's not simply a conversation. So I want to just kind of, in terms of the reflection of self-compassion, please understand that in our conversations today, I'm not suggesting that meditation and self-talk or self-reflections will be necessarily sufficient to get access to those deep layers. And this is my self-compassion message to all of you. Like, just recognize that even if you find it takes, many weeks, months, and years, that can be a really normal passage, that it takes a long time. This isn't simply about, okay, be self-compassionate and get over it. What are your thoughts on that, Frank?
Well, in my own case, I had a very traumatic event when I was 7 years old. My father, who was in World War II, had a flashback and died during that flashback. And so I had a very traumatic experience at age 7. And I think I probably turned the corner when I was about 67. So there was 60 years there of trying to find my way through various different kind of programs involving meditation, yoga, psychotherapy, et cetera, et cetera. And I eventually got to the point where I was able to through meditation, et cetera, to get aware of what kind of self-talk I was giving myself, which had a lot to do with grow up, get up, grow up, smarten up. You're not a kid anymore. You have to get stuff done, and that was sort of my messages given to myself all the time. So I was very hard on myself, and so I had to find my way to be taking more care of myself, being more compassionate with myself, and once I got to that point where I began to realize that it was a part of a common humanity, that it's actually built into the body, then I could begin to start using the various deep body work that was required to let the body let go of those tensions that it keeps to keep yourself safe, or at least the primitive brain thinks that's what it's doing. So it does take a very long time, and I basically became a trauma therapist because I was traumatized, and I had to find a way to take away all those layers and get under the infrastructure and treat myself kindly, and practice kindness towards myself as well as others, and eventually began to be able to get to the point where I could actually approach those old traumatic memories and not have the normal response, which would be typically for me, it was a matter of fear, because suddenly I was thrown into being an adult, and I was 7 years old.
Wow, that's a really difficult time in your life. You said that it wasn't until you were 67 that you really turned the corner, but I know that in fact you've been a very productive adult in your life, and that it's not like you haven't been able to do anything all these years. So what do you think was propelling you and giving you the strength to face the difficulties that you'd encountered?
Oh boy, that's a good one. Well, I guess my initial response to being suddenly losing my father was I basically had to grow up, and that was the message that I quickly learned, was that I wasn't actually. I just had to kind of, grasp the nettle and work hard, and so part of my addiction was work addiction. I worked very, very hard, but I was always. I was always very anxious as a young man, and I went through all the usual things, taking medications and et cetera, and then I began to, find ways to calm myself in other ways, meditation and yoga and affirmations and all of that stuff. And I went through years and years of psychotherapy, became a psychotherapist, eventually realizing that talk therapy has its limitations for people with trauma, in that it is mostly, the problem is that people who've been traumatized will try to avoid anything that's going to trigger those nasty emotions and those nasty feelings that they've had during the trauma. And so it's very difficult to do talk therapy with people because they don't want to talk about it. And so the approach that I found at age 67 was that it was through the body. And I must tell you that I can remember the age of 67 was because I was in a very deep depression at the time, and it was a suicidal depression. I finally got myself to the point where I was beating myself up so badly for not healing myself that I was actually, hurting myself. And so I emerged from all of that through the process of what you can see on what's emotional tuning. Actually, emotional tuning, it could also be called trauma therapy, but I sort of like the notion that it's a tuning process as opposed to a fixing process. You can't think of if you think of your emotional instrument that you can't overhaul it, but you can tune it up so that you can tune into the feelings of care and forgiveness and love and affection, or you can tune into the fear and flight and angry responses that are often come up for people who've been under severe trauma.
So I want to get back to this idea of how, like, it sounds like you gave yourself some strong messages about growing up and just getting to the task and doing what you needed to do, and
yes.
You dealt with a lot of stress as a result. But it sounds like you did what I suggest to a lot of people. Now, it's interesting to me that at 67, you found something that kind of shifted you into a better place.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've witnessed is that, whether it's, at 27 or, 72 or 55 or whenever it is, really people who seem to recover from trauma or manage or, apply these notions of self-compassion, whatever it is that's working, the idea is to practice and to
Absolutely.
find many strategies
Absolutely.
to apply, because yet I have not found one strategy that stands on its own that if applied to every single person will work. What
Right.
I have found is that people at various stages of their recovery experience relief from many different kinds of approaches, and it really depends on where are you now.
Mm-hmm.
And here's another self-compassion message. It's okay if the technique that everybody else you think is getting great benefit from, that you're not getting the benefit from this one, because it just may be a stage matter. It might be that at this particular stage in your recovery, you need a different approach.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to go and learn how to run or do
Exactly.
weightlifting or, meditation or self-compassion reflections, or, it's like find the thing that works for you today.
I have a metaphor that it seems to make sense for me. If you think of the infrastructure that you were speaking about earlier as kind of like an onion, and you can peel off each layer of the onion, and you'll probably get your eyes will sting and you might cry or whatever. But as you begin to work with something, for example, you mentioned exercise. Well, I ran until my knees gave out, and I indulged in alcohol and drugs, and it did all of that sort of self-harming stuff, and I also did a whole bunch of things that were much more kept me alive, which was the yoga and the meditation, and I tried just about everything. And it finally, when I kept peeling the onions off, for example, the psychotherapy that I received early in the game, I began to realize that the messages that I was giving myself and talking to myself about it and being negative towards myself about came from my family, came from my mother and my father. And they weren't my own messages, that I was just repeating them. You're not smart enough, be good, don't fool around, blah, blah, blah. So I found that eventually, when you get right down to it, for me, I got to the core, and my core, not everybody's core, but my core, had to do with the physical changes in my primary brain that would trigger off an anxious response when I began to remember things. And the problem for people who've been traumatized young is that those memories aren't necessarily conscious.
Yes.
And so you can feel the feelings without having any idea what's causing them. And that is a very uncomfortable situation to be in, because you're uncomfortable in your own skin and you don't know why. And so if your response to that is negative, like, why can you do this? You must be crazy. What's going on with you? Smarten up. What's going on? If you give yourself those messages for having those anxious feelings, then it just makes it worse.
I love what you just said right now, Frank. That is so perfect, because, I see this continuously, as you probably have as well, but the fact that you recognize it as your own experience is so profound. This idea of raw emotions that are not situated in a memory is very important, because, some people, their trauma may be pre-verbal.
Yes.
Some people may have trauma that is actually coming in from previous generations. So it could be content that we feel, like, let's say, for example, in our family of origin, a grandmother, experienced terrible destruction and loss in a fire in a family and a family home. And now you're dealing with, extreme fear whenever you're exposed to, somebody lights a match, or you're exposed to a really hot kind of surface, or, something, you get agitated and anxious when you're cooking because of the heat. This is the kind of stuff that can actually pour through the generations. This is epigenetics. And, we know that, and I talk about this, I've mentioned this research before, that, rats and humans are very similar, but, humans, our generations are, like every 20, 25 years, whereas with rats it's every, 30 days or something. So, we can test exposing a rat or a mouse to, let's say, a scent, and pairing that scent with a very stressful stimuli, and then what ends up happening is 2 and 3 generations down the line, just exposing that mouse or rat to a scent, they can have a very stressful reaction, even though they're not exposed to the stressful stimuli. So, if that's the case, it's also happening with human beings, and there's some research that seems to show this as well. I want to go back.
Just on that point. I mean, it's fairly easy for me to say I was traumatized at 7 with the death of my father, who was in a flashback. But it's also very possible that because my father was in this traumatic, catastrophic fight at Dieppe in 1942. I wasn't born till 44.
Right.
So any of the changes in his genetic structure that was caused by his trauma could have been passed along to me, and it would be completely beyond my capacity to remember it. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, I'm rationalizing where the trauma came from. It could have been that it came way before I was, when I was conceived.
Right, absolutely. And, I work with some very particular strategies in my clinic around how to lean towards that content without attaching it to a memory, and why that's very important to be able to do. So we learn how to, this is a self-compassion exercise in a way, because the instruction is something like, be friendly with yourself as you notice that inner experience, lean towards it, leaving space for it, be kind towards yourself, be a generous host, be gracious, be curious, so that what happens is we start to have a relationship with the place that is painful within inside of ourselves, the emotional place. And it's a very profound opportunity for big shift around inner experiencing with a great deal of self-compassion without the need to put it inside of a story, which, when we put things inside of a story, often what ends up happening is we just really get caught up in that storyline, and we believe it. Yeah, like mom was really bad to me. She always yelled at me. She told me I was worthless. Yeah. My mom didn't do that to me, but I'm just saying, if that's the content, that
become part of your identity. That
then
story becomes an explanation, but it also becomes something that kind of holds you back from seeing, identifying with another way of being.
Right, but it also becomes part of that infrastructure, that
Mm-hmm.
belief system, that infrastructure becomes so powerfully wired
Mm-hmm.
that it holds us. First of all, it ignites very quickly, as you were mentioning before, and it makes it very difficult for us to know the difference between somebody who's just saying, excuse me, but I need to get past you. We can take that very personally. Like, what, am I not here? Don't I count? Because the infrastructure makes us feel very easily vulnerable. But it really is not about our vulnerability. It's about the infrastructure, not the vulnerability in the moment. It's about the infrastructure that was built around belief and understanding, right? So that's pretty powerful. I want to go back to what Kristen Neff was reflecting on in a video that she showed that you shared with me, Frank. And I'm going to go over these little points because I think they're really worth reflecting on. And what they are basically Kristen Neff's suggestions on overcoming objections to self-compassion. And the first one that she outlines is confusion with self-pity.
Mm-hmm.
She says it's hard for all of us, that we struggle at times, and it's not simply about my struggle, but that struggle is universal, and really self-compassion is not self-pity. That there's a difference. It's not simply like you're like, oh, poor me. And that is really not the point at all. It's more about leaving space to recognize that this, that pain and suffering is universal. And I think that she does a good job of capturing how important that piece is. That is not the point. What were you going to say, Frank?
No, I was just agreeing with you that people who have got a negative, when they say they can't be compassionate to themselves, there's usually it's because I can't be compassionate to myself because that's just being kind of too easy on myself. It's too easy. I have what would happen if I wasn't hard on myself, I'd never get anything done. Those are the kinds of messages that you give yourself, and it's when you can begin to realize that this is a human condition that we exist in, that we are not as isolated as we might think we are. That these feelings are amongst us all, and one of the reasons why self-help groups like Alcoholics Anonymous have been so helpful to people is largely because it's a community. It's a support of love and affection amongst those people, and you need that kind of realization that yes, everybody does feel these ways, that I'm not isolated, and I shouldn't necessarily feel down on myself because I have these thoughts and feelings. Is that actually a lot of people do.
Yeah, and it's so easy to look at another person with kindness and to say, yeah, I totally get it. I'm really sorry. Maybe I've gone through something like that, but it just sounds like it's really rough for you right now. And be heart open toward that person, but sometimes toward ourselves we can be incredibly judgmental and harsh. And I think a lot of people believe that if they aren't harsh, like giving themselves a negative kind of encouragement, like, I'll just be a loser if I don't get up right now, or, I'll be a couch potato, that, self-compassion is also confused with self-indulgence.
Yes.
And that it can be very confusing because, we really believe it. I remember a couple of years ago I worked with a personal trainer for a very short time, and, he had this really strong notion that the only way to get himself motivated and other people was to be really harsh with them.
Right.
And I noticed that he was really, I had a friend who was working with this trainer as well, and I remember one day my friend saying he had an encounter with the trainer in which the trainer had kind of shamed him.
Mm-hmm.
And, he pointed it out to the trainer that this is not a motivator for him.
Right.
And the trainer just, couldn't wrap his mind around it. Well, you can imagine that the trainer didn't stay in business all that long. He ended up closing shop because really, in the end, it doesn't serve us well. And what I've seen with trauma recovery is that the majority of people who have emotional support, like social support, people that you can turn to, do tend to do better in their trauma recovery overall.
Absolutely.
And, I think that's also a kind of element of self-compassion, is to let people who are kind close to you, and to make a practice of inviting in kind and supportive people, or people who are engaged in activities that are supportive, that, lets you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. Feeling like you're part of a community can be really important. Like we actually have been working at our clinic on group-based programming for that very reason, because we find that people seem to do much better when they have community. And just to call out for people who are interested in emailing instudio101@gmail.com, and do join us in this conversation. I'm going to start reading a couple of emails because there's a whole bunch that just came in. But I'm going to go back to Alan just for a minute. Alan also references shame following a traumatic event, and how this can have a profound and pervasive effect on personal identity, and the self may be seen as defective, inherently bad, powerless, deserving of maltreatment, and something that must be kept hidden from others. Now, just in case you missed it, Alan, we do have we did a radio show last month on shame specifically, and it was very well received. So that's up on our website as well, and it can be found in iTunes on the Bear Psychology Radio Show, as well as on our website, traumapractice.org. So I'm going to move on to a couple of the questions that just came in. This is from Katie, and she says, isn't self-compassion a good thing for someone? I'm confused. Should we not show self-compassion for ourselves? Thank you. Love your radio show. Thank you so much, Katie. I love self-compassion, actually. I think it's a wonderful concept, and I think it's very meaningful. I guess I was trying to make sure that people weren't under the impression that I thought that was going to be it, and then, you can apply self-compassion and you'd be okay. I think it's a fantastic practice. I really encourage it. I like the Karuna practice, the one that is on our YouTube channel, called Self-Compassion for Trauma Recovery, and there's another one as well that we put together that is self-compassion reflection, and it's a guided relaxation. I think it's about 15 minutes. So I'm sorry if I've given you the wrong impression, Katie, but absolutely I love the self-compassion work, and I think Kristen Neff is brilliant for bringing it forward. I have great respect for it. And here's another one. If a person is depressed for some life event, does self-compassion help them get through it? Is self-compassion a type of psychotherapy? Thank you. So let's talk about this one, Frank. I think that's a good question. What are your thoughts on that? If a person is
having been severely depressed myself, one of the problems that you face when you're in that kind of state is that you are somewhat unaware of all the negative, how you're beating yourself up for being depressed. And of course, beating yourself up for being depressed and blaming yourself or shaming yourself is exactly what happens. You just basically dig the hole deeper. And so affirmations or being kind to yourself is a way to shift it from a blame game and a shame game into being more kind to yourself. And so it is very important that you are kind to yourself when you're in that kind of a state. And of course, the other thing is that when people are depressed, they often isolate themselves. So they don't have people around that could tell them or could be supportive of them and show them loving kindness, because they've isolated themselves in the process. So absolutely, confirmation, self-love, and all of those kinds of things that are very, very important to get yourself from sliding further and further into that state of depression where nothing means anything anymore.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I'm going to reference Kristen Ness again. She says, and when people are depressed, there does tend to be a lot of inner self-criticism. I just want to reinforce, I agree absolutely. So depression and self-criticism do tend to go hand in hand, and one does tend to reinforce a deepening of depression. So if we're battling ourselves, we will definitely struggle even more. So, Kristen says we're actually attached to self-criticism because it gives us an illusion of control. Wow, I think that is such a powerful statement. And this idea of self-compassion is about self-acceptance, not self-improvement. Like, this is not some kind of happy, get happy approach. It's about accepting that this is where you are right now and a kind of kindness around that. And then she goes on to say that self-compassion provides the emotionally supportive environment needed for change and growth. So, yes, of course, I actually really, really like this idea that we can we can create the right environment. We can, till the soil, fertilize, put support in place so that we can start to strengthen and grow from that more supportive place. So, I think that this idea of including self-compassion as a mechanism for growth and change and to reinforce our own well-being is really important. So thank you very much, Mason, for that question. And here's another. Hi, Paula. Now, Paula says this may sound like a foolish question. I doubt it. But basically, what is the difference between self-compassion and being a narcissist? Are they not the same in some way? I love that question, Paula. That is just brilliant. You see, she's saying it's a foolish question, but in fact, it's actually a perfect question. Yeah. So, that is actually a very, very important area to contemplate. So, when somebody is narcissistic and they're really leaning towards themselves, they have very, very low compassion, care, or consideration for anybody else. In other words, their sense of wanting to be seen in a positive light by other people is very primary. They will do anything to be seen as better than others. They will be very quick to manipulate a situation so that they are kind of on the top of the playlist, so to speak. And this is not so much about self-compassion or compassion in general, because they tend to be low compassion both with themselves and others. They tend to be low compassion with any shortcoming they may have with themselves, and they work very, very hard at raising their profile regardless of the impact that it may have on other people around them. Like, they want to win the game. They want to be center of attention. Do you want to add to that, Frank?
Well, as you said, it's an extraordinarily good question, because it can be a bit confusing to say that narcissists are supposed to be in love with themselves, right? I mean, that's the image. Narcissist looks into the pond and he sees his image and he falls in love with himself. But it's just because you have self-love does not mean to say you're a narcissist, because the qualities of a narcissist is, as you point out, is that it's very, very self-oriented. It's not other-oriented at all. You're manipulating the world around you so that you can look good, so that you can overcome your own sense of self-doubt, lack of self-confidence, lack of self-esteem. It's, to a large extent, is a mechanism that is set up to boost your own sense of self-esteem. That doesn't, and then quite often that self-esteem has to be bolstered by, more and more of this and that, and I look how much better I am than anybody else. So it's a very, very isolated spot to be a narcissist. It's not a you're kind of isolating yourself from the human race. And so self-compassion is an important idea in the sense that you can be compassionate towards others, but quite often you're not compassionate at all with yourself. And a narcissist, on the other hand, has got a grandiose idea of how important they are, and it's to a large extent a defense mechanism because they, at their very core, feel themselves to be quite worthless.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. That was a terrific question. Riley is asking if self-compassion is good for our mental well-being. Should we practice it? And if so, what is the best way? So I'm going to give you some resources, Riley, and for anybody else that's out there. First, I have to tell you, again, Kristen Neff, she's just brilliant at what she does. She's done a lot of videos, and she runs the selfcompassion.org website, and there are a lot of links and resources and meditations on her website that you can access. But I found a self-compassion step-by-step audio book through Sounds True, and I just loved it. I thought it was really beautifully done, and Dr. Neff talks a bit about her own history, you know, how she was struggling herself when she was finishing graduate school. She was going through a divorce. It was a difficult time, and, you know, she was trying to figure out her life, and she started to meditate, and she came across these karuna practices, which are the basis of self-compassion practices through the Buddhist tradition. She speaks a lot in the self-compassion step-by-step about different things that happened in her life and how she applied self-compassion in a very meaningful way. So it's an audio book that has a lot of material in it and a lot of different exercises. So if you want to go a little deeper into self-compassion and different approaches, I found that to be a beautiful audio book. I will also tell you that there are a couple of videos on our channel. One is called Self-Compassion for Trauma Recovery, and the other one is a self-compassion reflection exercise. And it is about 15 minutes, and it's a process exercise, and it actually is a really nice one because it has a lot of pieces that seem to help people to kind of more deeply understand, what it's like to say things to yourself. And this is where you start embedding self-talk. So I'm going to just walk you through this really quickly. So in the self-compassion reflection exercise, what I suggest is we reflect on a heartfelt, fully embodied, warm and positive emotion. And we do this kind of self-talking where we embed this language like this. May you have kindness in your life. May you have peace in your life. May you have health in your life. And then further embracing it by saying, I embrace kindness in my life. I embrace peace in my life. I embrace health in my life. So, you would give it out to somebody, but then you kind of really let it come in, let it wash over you, let it be part of how you live, really allowing yourself to be nourished by this inner languaging, which I think can be very beautiful. Do you have any resources that you want to share, Frank?
Well, in the website Emotional Tuning, there's a section. I think it's section 4. It's called Humming Affirmations, and the affirmation that I sort of discovered for myself that worked very well was, it goes along the lines that despite this, and you can fill in the blanks. It could be despite this suffering, despite this fear, despite this anger, despite this terrible feeling I have, I accept myself with love and understanding. And it's accepting yourself with love and understanding that connects with this notion of self-compassion. And the other addition to that is that never mind despite the suffering, but with this suffering, with this fear and with this anger, with these feelings that I don't like very much, I accept myself with love and understanding. So despite it, and even with it, it's a kind of an affirmation that's very broadly applicable. And when I say humming affirmations, I suggest that you put that affirmation into a tune that is almost like self-soothing. The tune is very rhythmic, and you can actually just hum the tune, and you will have the same effect as the feeling of the affirmation. So I found that humming a tune is something that a lot of people do. They sing. I used to have this song when I was a kid. For me, it was "Pack Up Your Troubles." Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag. It's a war song. And I realized that that just humming a song that is related to positive feelings and love and understanding can be a very effective way just to break the nonstop negativity that you can get into when you're self-criticizing all the time.
Beautiful. That sounds really nice. I like the different language that you use, because I mean, although self-compassion is a particular type of work, and the self-compassion scale that Dr. Neff created kind of measures how people respond to doing this self-compassion work, and it seems that people really do have a good outcome. In terms of the research, the outcome is actually quite good, that individuals with higher levels of self-compassion are more likely to report that they are as kind to themselves as they are with others, and this is negatively correlated with anxiety and depression. So what that means is, if you're practicing self-compassion and you're using a strategy that seems to be working for you, then you're less likely to feel anxious or depressed, or at least you'd have strategies to help you deal with that anxiety and depression, which is really fabulous. Another study at Ohio State University, researchers found that mindfulness and self-compassion equated to better sleep. Don't we all need that? And resiliency among 213 health professionals. So if you're tired and run down, then mindfulness and self-compassion could be a really great strategy potentially. But again, one of the things that I really, know to be true is it's not a one-time thing. I wouldn't suggest that you do this self-compassion reflection exercise and then say, well, I did it, I felt good when I was doing it, and now it doesn't make any difference to me anymore. So, that's it. It doesn't help. And I don't think that's true. I came across this really interesting video from this woman, Granny the Explorer, very sweet woman who is journeying around self-compassion and working on integrating her kind of own emotional story. And she very sweetly talks about her own life and how she's been on a journey of self-compassion, trying to really integrate speaking more kindly to herself, accepting herself more. And in the video, she talks about 2 simple strategies to boost her self-compassion. And, again, she will talk a little bit about meditation and, really the amount of time that it really takes and the level of acceptance that it takes. It's a nice one. It's also on YouTube, and it's called 2 Simple Strategies to Boost Self-Compassion. And it's by Granny the Explorer. And I think Granny the Explorer's whole main theme is, look, take the time to know yourself and learn what is it really going to take to accept yourself as you are, and don't expect it to be an overnight thing. I mean, we don't just say, okay, so I'll be accepting myself and then it's done. This is definitely a process. And so Steve has sent us an email as well, and he's asking, is being self-kind and self-compassionate the same thing? What do you think, Frank? Is being self-kind and self-compassionate the same thing?
Pretty close. I can't really I can't really make a difference, except that compassion is got to do with alleviating suffering. So you could be kind to yourself without necessarily being in a state of suffering. So I think that's probably the distinction, is that the compassion is somehow related to suffering, where, for example, being grateful isn't necessarily so, or loving kindness isn't necessarily about alleviating suffering. But compassion is about how do you respond when you are suffering and when you are in pain, when you're fearful, anxious, angry, upset, can't sleep, whatever. What do you do about that? And it is got to do with self-talk and what you say to yourself, but it's also got to do with very simple things, like having a good diet, like getting enough sleep, like taking time off. It's got to do with being good to yourself, and so in your sense, being kind to yourself is a strategy that it certainly complements being self-compassionate.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I think you really raised the central issue, is this whole idea that really, and this comes back to what we started with. Compassion means to suffer with.
Mm-hmm.
And when we learn how to lean towards that with a great degree of willingness, then we open up doors that we might not have opened before. This willingness to show up for this place of pain, and it tends to not be where we go. We tend to walk in the opposite direction from that. We tend to, reject that part of ourselves or our experience. And I think social media is a big problem when it comes to these kinds of things, because we see a lot of images of people who are smiling, doing well, posting pictures of family events, and if we start comparing ourselves, if we're sitting in the muck of torn up driveways and broken pipes and things that are maybe not working very well at the moment, and we start blaming ourselves, oh my God, why wasn't I watching more carefully, or how come I don't, how come I'm in this situation? By the way, I have a big board meeting tonight, so this is kind of funny because I have a lot of people coming over to my home, and they're just going to have to walk through like a bit of a disaster zone, and of course we'll try to make sure that we guide them in safely. But the reality is I could put myself in a highly stressed state, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to remind myself that I can be okay with how things are, that I can leave some space for the imperfection. And, it's funny just saying that out loud, even though, I'd kind of already made my mind up that, people are coming over and this is how it's going to be and I'm accepting it. It's funny because just saying this out loud in this moment, because I hadn't articulated it out loud. So I'm glad. Thank you, everybody out there, for letting me share this with you.
Yeah, you got a compassionate audience there.
Exactly. That, it's a really great thing just to say it out loud, to say, you know what? I'm going to, give myself, this kind of kind, approach, and I'm going to embrace this kindness for myself, and I'm going to be peaceful about, having a construction zone as the entryway to the space people are arriving in, and I'm going to embrace peace around that, and I'm going to embrace health around that. And I want to encourage all of you to see if you can use these words with yourself and, try them out with people in your life as well. And I'm going to just go back to these 6 statements. Reflect on heartfelt, fully embodied, warm, and positive emotion. May you, all of my listeners out today, and you as well, my friend Frank, and Jerry, the radio host, I want you to also take this in and see if you can receive this as well as you can. May you have kindness in your life. If there's stuff that you're going through that's really tough, may you have peace in your life with what you're facing, because I know that, there are people out there who are facing things. So see if you can allow that to sink in a little bit. May you have peace in your life. And may you have health in your life. May you allow that as part of your life. May you pick up all the cues and reminders that it's time for you to take care of yourself as well and to leave space for that. And then maybe I'll say this out loud, and maybe silently, if you could repeat this to yourself, or if you're in a place where it's quiet, I embrace kindness in my life. See if you could say that to yourself. I embrace peace in my life.
I embrace peace in my life.
I embrace health in my life.
I embrace health in my life.
And I want to just thank you so much, Frank. I look forward to more conversations with you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. It's been a great time.
Yes, it's
a great topic.
It's a great topic, and it's been so much fun to have you here, Frank. And I want to thank everybody out there for your great questions and just being part of this work and this conversation. And I want to thank Gary as well. And wishing everybody a gentle day. And I am signing off. This is Dr. Anna Baranowski, wishing all of you a gentle day.
A gentle day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Bear Psychology Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.